Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I am on the steering committee of the Newburyport Literary Festival. We are in our 19th edition this year. We had a full day of events here in Newburyport, Massachusetts yesterday, which was wonderful. And now we have a day of events online, which we're so excited about. And I'm here with Toni Reavis and Lauren Grodstein to talk about their books. But before we get to that, I just want to make a few announcements. The first is thank you to our sponsors. The Newburyport Bank and the Institution for Savings have been our founding sponsors and with the festival since 2005, and also the Mass Cultural Council. These organizations really make the festival possible, as well as donations from our participants. So we thank everyone for all of your support. I am going to ask our authors, Toni and Lauren, to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their projects so that we can get a little bit more familiar with both of them. So Lauren, why don't we start with you? Tell us about your amazing project.
Okay, so my name is Lauren Grodstein. I am the author of 6 works of fiction, one short story collection, 5 novels. My most recent book is called We Must Not Think of Ourselves. It was the Today Show Read with Jenna Pick for December 2023. And it tells the story of a group of actual archivists. They call themselves the Oneg Shabbat archivists, who worked in the Warsaw ghetto from its founding in 1940 to its destruction in 1943. It's told through the perspective of an English teacher who taught underground English lessons. And although it's a fictional story, so much of what happens in the novel is real, and also so much of it, I think, still sort of resonates today in terms of record keeping and history telling and the way in which people get to own their stories. So that's a little bit about my most recent book.
And Toni, what about you?
Well, my name is Toni Reavis, and I've been a sports broadcaster most of my career. My book, BISIA ISHAM, the Countess and the P.O.W., is actually the story of my parents and how they came to that union. Mom was a Polish countess born in a 16th century castle, joined the underground as the war got started, spoke fluent German and French and Polish, of course. Pop was the general manager of a hotel in St. Louis. After Pearl Harbor, he joined the U.S. services. He got captured in Italy in late 1944, spent 4 months in German prison camp, then escaped, making his way east, trying to find an American mission with whom to repatriate. Mom was on her way to the front, both ending up on Valentine's Day, 1945. They ended up in the Artist Café in Lublin, Poland. Mom didn't speak English and Pop didn't speak Polish. And 11 days later, they got married. The book is the tales which led them to the Artist Café in Lublin, Poland. And then Mom's 9 months it took to escape from Soviet-occupied Poland, making her way to the Czech border in a boxcar, and then making her way into Nuremberg, where she hooked up with Patton's Third Army. And in December, boarded a Liberty ship in Antwerp and sailed to America, and hoping to reunite with a husband she barely knew. So, as I always say, it's a story and a half.
Right, absolutely. So just to follow up on that, Toni, and why did you decide you wanted to write this? I mean, why did you decide that everyone should know your parents' story?
Anyone ever heard the story when we were young? The rudiments of it, you know, this Polish countess, underground fighter, marrying a POW that she knew a week and a half and didn't speak the same language. Everyone said, somebody's got to write a book. I mean, it was like you heard it over and over again. And finally, it dawns on you, well, I agree with them. And then I was looking around, and it finally dawned on me that, oh, I should be looking in the mirror. And it ought to be me who tells the story. And so by chance, we began one day, as these people don't like to tell these stories because there's too much pain, too much loss. But I finally got into them, and when we finally got started, then it ramped up quite quickly, and it came out because it is a great story.
Lauren, I have the same question essentially for you, but you tapped into these archives to do some of the reporting for your story. So your book. So I wanted to ask how you came to those and how you came to this novel, which is historic fiction.
So in 2019, before the pandemic, my sister took my family of 4, my brother's family of 4, my parents, and her mother-in-law on a heritage tour of Poland. Our family had been from Warsaw, but they escaped. Most of them escaped about 20 years before the war began, and most of them settled in New York City. And it was my nephew's bar mitzvah. He didn't want a big party. He just wanted to do this trip. And it was fascinating and amazing. But by the end of it, you know, it was also really heavy. And the kids that were with us were between the ages of 1.5 and 13. So by the end of it, a lot of them skedaddled to go see the National Sports Stadium, which was perfect. But my sister, my parents, and I ended up at this very small museum in Warsaw. It was called the Jewish Historical Institute. We did not know what that meant. We didn't know anything about what would be in there. Our tour guide did not really tell us much. And you walk into this room and you see written on the wall in Polish and in Hebrew and in English, I'm sorry, Polish, Yiddish, and English, what we've been unable to shout out to the world. And then you walk through this museum and you see everything that these archivists collected, from diary entries to newspapers, propaganda posters, reviews of, they had a Shakespeare Society, reviews of the plays, notes about what they knew of the war, notes about the underground schooling, notes about underground religious services. And it was just unbelievable. I'd been to Hebrew school. I had had a, you know, not a very strict Jewish upbringing, but I certainly thought I knew the basics of, you know, Jewish history, especially in World War II, but I had never heard of this group, the Oneg Shabbat Archive. So when we left the building, when we left this museum, I said to my sister, you know, there are like 1,000 novels in that room. And she said, well, you should write one. And I said, I will not, because I had never wanted to write historical fiction. I had certainly not ever intended to write about the Holocaust. That was something for much sort of better minds than my own. But then during the pandemic, when, you know, the world shut down and the normal rules didn't apply anymore, I thought, well, what the hell? You know, I have the story. I've been reading the archive just for myself since I'd come home. It was online and not hard to do. And I'd been so interested in this time period. I'd ordered some books about it and I'd read them. So I felt like I could just give it a shot. I could just start. And then it turned out once I started, I couldn't stop doing it. And so all the, you know, when I wasn't homeschooling or attempting to bake terrible sourdough, or just, you know, I used to write hours and hours whenever I'd have a day to myself, but that didn't exist anymore. So instead I would write for 10 minutes or 5 minutes or half an hour. And in that way, I got the manuscript done and I gave it to my agent, who was very surprised that I had done historical fiction, because that was not at all anything I'd ever talked about doing. But she liked it. So she said, you know, let's give it to your editor and see what happens. So that's how the novel came to be.
Lauren, that's when you know you've got a good one, when you can't not put your time into it, when it calls you.
Exactly. Yeah. And when there's really nothing else you'd rather be doing.
Exactly.
Is that how you felt writing your book?
You know, very much so.
Yeah.
I had all the letters that Pop wrote back home to his mother and brother and sister during the wars. That was the internet of their day. And so soldiers had a tendency to write 4, 5, 6 letters a week. And so she kept them all. So I've got all these binders, all that contemporaneous information. So you really get inside the feelings of these people. And that's the point. Once you entertain that you get to know these people, and then they become compelling to you. Obviously, these are my parents, but parents are suns and moons, you know, that in your world as a child. You don't know them as Isham and Bisha. I mean, Isham, an old family surname, by the way. That's my father's name. You know, 7th generation Isham in America. Bisha is the diminutive of Elżbieta, Elizabeth in Polish. So that's why those particular names. But just getting to know those people was also very important, and then trying to, you know, look at that history and see how that history actually reflects on what's happening in today's world.
Did he send letters back about Bisha?
I found some letters, yes, that he wrote back when they got married in 11 days.
And I'm sorry, I realize I'm sort of, I just find your story so fascinating. I can't help asking about it.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Yeah, like why in 11? What? Why in 11 days?
Pop had been in prison camp 4 months. They almost died. Both almost died. Both killed people at a very close range. Both had seen quite deeply into what war could be. Mom was the youngest of 6 children, 4 brothers and older sister. Father was 48, her mother was 40 when she was born into this noble family living in the 16th century castle. She was brought up by governesses, not her parents. She kissed their hand at breakfast and at dinner. But he was 48 and 40, so she was almost treated like even the next generation down. So that's very important. She wasn't taken seriously. And so she became the rebel. The first daughter after 4 boys was the father's favorite, et cetera, et cetera. And so when the war started, she jumped right in there. It turns out because the castle was on the eastern bluff of the San River, the San River was one of the demarcation lines of the Molotov-Ribbentrop secret pact between the Germans and the Russians. Everything east of the San would be Russian occupied. Everything west would be German occupied. Well, you don't want to be members of the nobility dealing with the Russians. So notwithstanding who the Germans were, they were still Holy Roman Empire and still, Christian. And so from that standpoint, they had a hunting lodge 10 kilometers on the other side of the San. So that's where they went during the war. And because her father still had to run the estate, there was reason to have military-aged men on the property. The Polish government in exile then asked him if they could appoint the general manager to the estate to give that man a cover job that would allow him to be in that part of Poland. So the cellars, in the cellars of this hunting lodge, 3-story building, beautiful place, there was a bunker that was hidden behind all the logs for the burning fires, for the cooking fires and the fireplaces. And that's where he had radios and maps and weapons and ammunition. And so that household became the center for the underground movement in that part of Poland. And that guy lived in the house. And so mom spoke German. She was attractive. So wherever she would go, she would just, start conversing. And they'd tell her stuff, and then she'd go back and tell her people stuff. And so she lived like that. And she took to it in many ways. But by the time the war was over, there was nothing left. Every one of her other brothers and sisters had been married. 2 of her brothers were in Soviet camps. Another brother was fighting on the British side. So there was nothing left. They saw what was coming, and that's why they. And I think she took a chance on this guy, and this guy, in a world of uncertainty, he was absolutely certain. When she walked into that cafe, he said, literally, "That's the one for me." 5 minutes after meeting, he asked the guy he escaped with, who spoke a little Czech, ask that one if she's married. No, she's not. Asked her if she's engaged. No, she's not. And they say, they want to know why you're asking all these personal questions. Pop says, tell her because I'm going to marry her. They thought it was a joke. 11 days later, they were walking down the aisle in the church across the street. I mean, it was like there was something. Pop said in wartime, Tone, you don't analyze, you act. Your whole world is the 10 feet on your left, the 10 feet on your right, and where's my next meal coming from? That's your whole world. And when he saw mom, somehow he saw redemption in the world he had just come from, which was so horrific. And she saw a chance at something that might exist in the future that she could build for herself because there was nothing left at home.
Wow, it's really amazing. We talked a little bit in our first conversation about how war is so devastating, but also brings people together in ways that they never would have found each other if the war hadn't been going on.
Leslie, it's interesting. I remember the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, PBS, and he was saying before the Civil War, it was called These United States of America. After the Civil War, when people had to get out of their states and their hometowns for the first time in their lives, it became the United States of America.
Right.
A different perception of what the country was. It wasn't these, it was the. It wasn't a number of things, it was one thing. And that's when it was finally happened. And like you say, that's what war was. I'm saying, how random are any of us? And yet, mom and pop, those thousands of miles and cultures away, and somehow, and we always used to joke that, they didn't speak the same language. In 64 years, mom died, and I don't know if they ever spoke the same language. not completely sure. Right. But there was a great devotion that they had for one another, as they had been places that no one else but the other person had.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you both a little bit more about research. Obviously, you did a lot of digging and finding historical documents. Is there a point when you have too much? Especially, I'm going to start with Lauren on this one, but Tony's obviously got a whole, sure. He's lived with the subject for his whole life, but Lauren had, a ton of archival information that you were going through. How do you whittle that down? And as a corollary, are there any things that you had to let go that still haunt you?
So the problem with research is that it's a great way to substitute for writing, and you can still tell yourself you worked, right? You did what you set out to do, but actually you didn't do anything. You just, messed around on the internet all day. So I was pretty disciplined about not letting myself over research. And in fact, I took the advice of a friend who said, just make it up, just make everything up. And then after you're done and you know what you need to know, that's when you should go back and check. Because if you try to do all the research you think you might need to know before you get started, you'll never get started.
That's so interesting.
So that was pretty helpful. I did have a list of major World War II events taped to my desk, and that was just so I could cross-reference what was happening in the ghetto, with what was happening in the outside world. And that made me really think about the United States' role in the war. The ghetto was a year and a half old by the time the US got involved at all. And the Wannsee Conference, the conference where where the Nazis decided on the final solution of exterminating the world's Jews, happened very shortly after America got involved. I mean, America really, what I'm saying is America really sort of twiddled its thumbs for a very long time. And that was something I just hadn't really been aware of. Like, I was forced to see World War II on a Polish timescale and not an American timescale. And that really changed the way I thought about the war. Both my grandfathers, were World War II veterans. They sort of trained me about how to think about this time period with this, not real triumphalism, but a sense of accomplishment, and a sense that like America got in there and did the job that was supposed to be done. Maybe they started a little too late, maybe they didn't do everything right, but they were the good guys. When you look at the war from a Polish perspective, you see it entirely differently. America is not the protagonist at all, and it's really a story of horror and destruction that leads to more horror and destruction, the horror and destruction of communism. So I think that was the most rewarding or challenging and fascinating, all of those things. Part of the job was to see a part of history that I thought I knew as one thing, and I had to learn how to see it as something else.
Right, got it. So Toni, you may have had a similar experience, that you saw your parents in some way and you learned to see them in a different way, but you've got a lot of data. So how did it shake out for you?
Speaking of which, my original manuscript was about over 140,000 words, and the book is 75, I believe. So a lot of it was taking which stories maintain the clear through line and not go down too many rabbit holes, which is very easy to do. World War II is such a complex time. I mean, a lot of people think it's even World War I and World War II is the 30 years war, the second time that's happened. It's just like it's one thing, and the Treaty in Versailles did not resolve the issues at hand. They just exacerbated them in many ways and drew up a lot of resentment. And so going back and looking at that and seeing family archives. When I went over to Poland for the first time in 1987, I was a sports writer for the Boston Herald and did a radio show about running in Boston. And the World Cross Country Championships were being run in Warsaw. Bingo, I'm going to cover it. Mom, you're going with me. Only the second time she had been back to Poland since she came to the United States in '46. Didn't become a citizen until 1968 because you had to renounce your previous allegiances. And Mom says, how do you renounce who you are? Poles are very, very proud people. I mean, every nation's proud, but they are particularly proud. And so when we went over there, that was the first time I met my uncles, first cousins, but I also the family archives. Went to the castle, which is now a hotel. Went back to the Artist Cafe in Lublin, which is pretty much the same. Went to the Europa Hotel, where they had their reception, a little reception. And the waiter saw my tape recorder. He said, what are you doing? We said, oh, I'm telling the story of my mom who got married and her reception was here. And he gave us a place setting to take home for Pop. So there was a lot of stories that you just had that were not nice stories, good stories, but you didn't need them. So I had a ton of stuff which I had to set aside, and but I'm glad I did.
Were there any things that you really wished you could have kept?
Because this is a story about a man and a woman, I wanted to bring up the fact that there were other men, other women, and so there was some, here's Pop dealing with women, here's Mom dealing with men, and then in the end, I just didn't think it was necessary. And so I left those kind of stories out, even though some of them were very funny. It didn't bring out any facet of their personality that wasn't brought out another way. So we didn't actually miss anything.
Right, gotcha. So we have two different genres here, obviously. We've got memoir and historical fiction. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how those things cross over and, how the genres sort of overlap. When you're writing a memoir, how, you have to fictionalize part of that. And I was really intrigued, Lauren, about what you were just talking about, how you wrote first and then did the research later. So Toni, why don't we start with you? How do you feel like those things overlapped for you?
Well, I mean, as I say, truth is hard to convey. And so using what you think is reality versus the way Lauren presented it, I mean, that is a very thin line. If it's details of a larger, tableau, certainly, but they're all valid. And as you said, there's things made up in my book. I mean, dialogue, there's scenes, so in many ways, where is truth is somewhere in the middle of all of that. So I don't see a big distinction between the two in many ways.
You need a plot, right? I mean, you can't have a memoir without a plot. Plot is crucial, characters are crucial. So many things really matter, regardless of the form that you're writing, the genre you're writing. You need the same skills. You need to be able to draw a reader in and make that reader want to keep turning pages. And so regardless if you're dealing with material that is sort of, as Toni just said, everything there's, truth is subjective in so many ways, not, so certainly the idea of narrative truth is subjective. So you have to figure out what to include, how to be as truthful as possible to the reality of what you're describing, but also keep readers interested and invested. So it's always sort of a delicate act.
Flow is important. Flow is huge. Yeah. Trying to get into that flow where one thing just automatically leads to the next without any thought. You don't want any clangs. You're trying to avoid the clanging.
Yeah. And you want to make sure that the story feels, I mean, certainly because Toni and I both, I think, feel such, if I may, just such devotion to our subjects. You also want to make sure to honor them by getting it as right as you possibly can.
Primarily.
Even though
that would be primary.
It's also impossible, right? Like you want to get it perfect, and also that you cannot. And so that leads to its own set of complications.
Yeah, the perfection, the enemy of the good. You can't. And the hardest thing I had, of course, I don't know about you, having written so many more books than me, that putting it down, finishing it, saying it's complete, not going back constantly. I'm a little obsessive. I was taught by Sacred Heart nuns and Jesuit priests, and so we diagrammed sentences and we took Latin, and so the grammar and syntax and such things are important. And just going back and trying to get everything just so was always important, but you can get stuck in that as well. So
for sure,
you need help in digging yourself out and say, okay, put that damn thing to bed.
Yeah, you're done now. Yeah.
I do want to ask about both of your processes a little bit in a minute, but I do want to also remind our participants you can ask questions. So those in the Q&A, we'll get to those shortly. But Lauren, you touched on this a little bit about how your thinking about World War II evolved while you were doing this research. You were able to see it from a different perspective. Were there other instances of that where your thinking evolved on the history of these events through your research?
I mean, I think in just doing the research, I was able to go back to, I was able to go back to Poland a few times. I also was in the Baltics. I think it's just like being on the ground in which these things happened just magnifies the immensity of it, the tragedy of it. It's the sort of thing that you can read about from a distance, or you can connect to in person. And I found myself like in the forests outside of Riga, where Jews were forced from their homes and shot by the thousands, or standing in a bunker or like a concrete sort of semi-underground room in Poland, where when you turned on the spigots, poison gas came out and people died. Like to be in these places, I think just sort of underlined how important it was for me to get things right, because this is how people who previously had been living full, rich, three-dimensional lives became erased and just numbered. And yeah, I mean, I think the experience of being in these places, seeing them with my own eyes, didn't change what I felt, but it strengthened my commitment to doing it right by them.
Did
How
you
about
go
you,
to
Toni?
Auschwitz,
Mhm.
Lauren? Yeah,
Yeah.
they're very, very powerful. I always remind
Yeah.
myself it was the Germans. The Germans have a lot of history to be very, very proud of. I mean, these are top end Western civilization folks. They did this. That's what should frighten everyone. If they're susceptible, anyone's susceptible. And so
Right.
when you go there, you realize that that was not necessarily the aberration. That's the entropy toward which we constantly have to fight. This is a huge part of human nature that was set free, and it's never is have to be constantly on the alert for such things. And that's
Yeah.
what I found out when I went there, because it was just, how did horror become so every day?
Yeah, Auschwitz was built when, in my imagination, Auschwitz had been a place that was sort of set apart, or that was just not a place that nobody could have known about, because if you knew about it, how could you live next to it? But actually, Auschwitz was built where it was built in a Polish town called, my pronunciation, Toni, you can pronounce this better than I can, but Oświęcim,
Oświęcim.
Oświęcim, which was the name of the town, right? It was about half Jewish. That's why Auschwitz was put there. There were Jews already there. The town continued to exist. It still exists. It's a place where people live. The murder was not separate from the societies in which it was happening. It was just hidden among or not even hidden. It was just built in the places where people were living, and it happened among people who kept living, and that remains sort of the most entrenched mystery for me, is like, how could so many people just go about their business while factories of death were in their backyards? In Denmark, which saved almost its entire Jewish population, the king said, if you make all the Jews wear, and there weren't that many Jewish people, there were about 5,000, but if you make them wear armbands, and Denmark had been occupied early by the Germans, I myself will wear an armband. And so, and then when it became time, when someone told the Danes that they were coming that night, I think it was Yom Kippur, to take all the Jews, the Danes smuggled them all out to Sweden in fishing boats. And so you think, like, well, actually it was possible to resist. Actually, it was possible to do the right thing. They did it in Denmark. It was possible. If you could do it in Denmark, you could do it anywhere. Denmark borders Germany. Denmark was occupied, but people chose not to. And you see that just everywhere, because as Toni said, it happened in this incredibly first world place. It is sort of, it is the darkness in all of us that we do have to resist constantly.
Well, it was very much anti-Semitism was very strong in Poland. The town where my mom grew up, Lesko, in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, was 60% Jewish, about 4,000, 5,000 people, 60% Jewish, Sephardic Jews coming from Spain many centuries before and settling there. But Mom always referred to, everyone knew people who had been killed. Everyone knew people killed, but everyone was afraid. Everyone was just afraid, and they got themselves into that moral paradox and couldn't get out of it. But that anti-Semitism underneath lay beneath the whole thing. So in many ways, it was going to be very difficult for the Jewish people. I mean, very obviously beyond difficult. But it was like Germany had that in common, Poland had that in common, Russia had that in common. It was not a good place for Jewish people.
Right.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the writing process for you all, because that's something that our participants are always really eager to hear about. And what your day looked like in writing. Did you write? Lauren, you mentioned you write in little spurts, between homeschooling and different kinds of things. But What was the process like for you otherwise? Toni?
Well, in general, I don't. So that was really, those were pandemic conditions. Generally, I write just on my laptop in Word. I don't have any fancy, I don't write longhand. I don't have any fancy programming or anything like that. I try to write as many pages a day as I can. They don't have to be good pages necessarily until I have a first draft. And I try to get that out pretty quickly. Then I print it, scribble all over it, enter all my changes, scribble all over them. And I go through that, several times until I have a draft that's good enough to show someone else. And then I take that person's changes, do it again. So for me, it's really an iterative process. It's not, and it's collaborative, which I like. I get it as far as I possibly can, and that's when I invite in readers.
Reminds me a little of the comments that Annie Lamont makes about shitty first drafts. You just got to get the first draft, and even if it's you're going to go back and change it. It may not be great, but you need to get those words down. Right. Toni, what's the process like for you? And I also wonder how it differs from your day job where you're, a broadcaster and you want to get your words out immediately.
A lot of my broadcasting is preparing for events. For like 40 years, I broadcast the Boston Marathon. And that was just a couple of weeks ago. So when you're studying for that, it's the same thing. A lot of research. You got to research all the athletes, the history of the event, the history of these athletes against one another, et cetera, et cetera. So you bring all that. And it's just, again, it's a lot of research. And I was always a good note taker. I keep journals. I'm up to number 271. And a lot of the books are all those journals. I mean, because a lot of my process with Mom and Pop was the interviews I did with them, and they lived in St. Louis. I lived in Boston, and so I would just get them on the telephone. And of course, it's much easier having been a print reporter and a radio reporter and a television reporter. Every step along the way makes it more difficult to get people calm to tell their story. If you're just scribbling a story and looking at them, you can do one thing. The minute you put a microphone on their face, they become a little bit reticent. And then you put lights and a microphone in front of their face, and now you kind of freak them out. So being at their own home, it was easy for them to let their story be told. But again, I didn't print it out. I would do I went mom, pop, mom, pop, mom, pop, chapter mom, chapter pop, chapter mom, chapter pop, and then coming together, and then separating again, and then coming together again. So I had particular stories in a chapter. So that's how I would write that story, and then go on to the next story, and et cetera. But then let it sit. And then, a week or two later, come back and hit it again as you're a slightly different person. And it doesn't look quite like, the way you put it down in the first place. So that was the process.
And how long did it take from the time you decided to write this story to, having words that were publishable?
Oh, it's crazy because I kept putting it down. As I said, the first hint of the book was in 1985 when I called home on Valentine's Day. Just called up to say, how you doing, Mom and Pop? And Pop said, tell him it was on this day 40 years ago that your mother and I met. And Mom on the upstairs line said, yes, in the Artist Cafe in Lublin, Poland. Bingo. They're the heart of the story. Fine. I had my notebook out. What were you wearing? What time of day? Just everything. Give it to me. We've begun. So that was in 1985. In 87, I went to Poland, went again in 90, went again in 93. But then life and everything else gets in the way, and you have to do that. You put it aside. But people kept encouraging me, Toni, you got to finish that book. You got to finish that book. And then finally, near the end of their lives, I realized I got to get cooking. And I did. So I actually finished it, and I let it sit there for years and years and years again, even when it was finished. And then finally in 2022, I finally put it out, but it could have been done 10 years earlier. Again, like I said earlier, I had a hard time putting it away.
Interesting. I like all the aspiring writers to note that is a more than 40-year timeline for the one book. So, take your time if you need to. We do have some questions from the audience, and one sort of dovetails well into your last statement, Toni. This is from Betsy Westendorf, who is also on the steering committee of the festival. She wanted to know what your parents' reactions were to the book.
I think they were pleased, but they saw the manuscript. They died before the book came out, but they read the whole manuscript. And Pop was funny. Pop was funny. Of course, he was now very old, but he said, he said, Tone, I've read your book, and how do you know all that thing? That's exactly what was happening. How did you know that? I said, well, Pop, you told me. I wrote it down. But so he had forgotten that he told me everything. But it was like, and that was the beauty of it, getting to know them as those individual people. And still having those, I can go back and listen to the tapes. And so it's great being able to kind of relive that story. And it is it's a very particular story, but there's thousands like it. I mean, like Lauren's. I mean, there's sadly in war, the stories are multitudinous.
Lauren, you started your journey on this book with your family as well. How did they react when the book came out?
I think they were, I think they were pleased. I think they're just sort of surprised that this is what I do. Everyone else in my family does more normal things. So, but they're supportive and they love me, and so they're pleased that I do this weird thing, even though I don't know that they necessarily would have chosen it for me. They would have chosen something slightly more predictable and remunerative, but that's fine.
Well, I come from a family of writers.
Did you always know you were, because you have a perfect voice for a sports broadcaster. Every time you start talking, I'm like, of course, this is what you do.
Lauren, when I moved to Boston from St. Louis, I go up to go up to Store 24, get my coffee at Muffin. And every damn day they say, oh my God, you sound like you're on the radio. You want to be on the radio.
You do. You have the most radio voice I've ever heard.
I know. Well, as it turns out, I finally opened up the Yellow Pages and I called radio stations in the Boston area and I said, listen, 500,000 Polish children can't all be wrong. And I got out of that, I got 5 auditions. And out of that, I got a job at a radio station doing news from 3 to 11 o'clock on Saturdays and Sundays when I probably couldn't hurt anybody, and got to learn my craft. But ever since, Pop had this voice. The Reavis men have this voice. And Pop was a gemologist. But when we'd do inventory, my sister, brother, and I would go help to make a little extra money. Pop would give the instructions. And I asked the general manager, well, how come Pop's doing that? He says, listen to him. People listen when your father talks. So I always knew that I got Pop's voice. And then having no idea what I was going to do for a living, when people finally told me what I should be doing for a living, I just took them on their word.
Mm-hmm. It's an amazing voice.
And it turned out great.
Yeah.
So Jordan Taylor, who is also a writer, and she will be on the panel at 2:15 for YA Mysteries. So thank you, Jordan, for this question and for joining in. But she has a question for you, Lauren. So she's his fellow historical fiction author, and she asks, how do you plan your itineraries when you're traveling for book research? Do you try and prioritize museums or real life historical sites?
Oh, that's such a great question. I just jam in as much as I possibly can. So that meant in Warsaw, I did a lot. I mean, I was really worried about getting things wrong, including just geography. So I did a lot of walking around and just making sure that the things I said were to the east, and the things that I thought were in the north were in the north. And it turned out I got some things wrong. So I was really happy to have a chance to go do that. I also love to talk to people, even though people's memories can be flawed. It's still, you get a sense of the vibe, I guess. I mean, I really liked talking to any Polish person who could speak enough English with me and who was interested in talking about before and now and what it was like. And then, museums are actually quite helpful to me. So there's an incredible World War II museum in Gdansk, which used to be called Danzig in northern Poland on the Baltic. That museum is just incredible. And that really taught me a lot about the way Polish people see World War II. It's also near the museum that's dedicated to the Lech Walesa and the strikes that ended up bringing down communism in Poland and in Eastern Europe. So you can really see the sort of historical continuum that from World War I, kind of through World War II, through the protests. It's sort of a 50 or even 80-year series of events in one town. So doing that, so being on the ground, and honestly, even if I didn't go to any museums or talk to anybody, I find that just breathing the air that my characters would have breathed, eating the foods that they would have eaten, looking at the street signs gives me the courage I need to write. That's a great question.
Toni, yeah, Toni, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that same question. Obviously, you did some traveling for your book, and so I'd love to hear how your thoughts are about traveling back.
Well, I think it's very important. I don't think you can be honest with yourself or write a book, either one of these books, without that tactility. You have to be there. I always kept asking Mom and Pop, the teacher, what was the size of the room? How many tables? How many chairs? How many stairs? There was a stage. I mean, so you can only ask so much of it and try to picture that in your head. You got to go there, and as much as you can. I wanted to go to the places where they were the critical parts of that. The apartment where Pop first moved when he moved to St. Louis with his grandmother. The hotel, which is still there in St. Louis right now. Just as many places as you can go to that you can put yourself in that position and just orient yourself, and it just put those stories into a context that without those visits you would never have, and nor could portray to your readers.
We just got a comment from Arthur, who wants to encourage you, Toni, to write some books about running.
Oh, okay, I should. I got all the damn journals. I did a radio show called Runner's Digest from 1977 to 1988. It was a weekly talk show about running in Boston when the marathon was in its running boom phase. And Bill Rogers was the 4-time Boston Marathon and 4-time New York City Marathon champion. And Joan Benoit Samuelson was the first Olympic gold medalist for America in Los Angeles in '84. And I was running with these guys every day. I couldn't race with them, but I could train with them. And I'd carry my tape recorder with me. And I'd interview Bill and Joan and all the other athletes. And then I would edit it down and it'd be part of my show. But I've got 500 hours of this audio tape from the running boom years and all my journals. Yeah, so it's one of those things where I've got so much stuff, I've got too much stuff, and I have a hard time getting myself in a position where I can kind of just get okay, people, places, things. I mean, what am I going to reduce this darn thing to? But I should, and I probably will. Thank you, Arthur.
And we had another question from Kathy about, obviously, these topics are incredibly grave and heartbreaking. And so did it become too much for you as you gathered the information and were researching these books? And then I would just add, how did you deal with that? Which I would expect is sort of inevitable. Lauren, why don't we start with you?
I think that I sort of disassociate when I'm working. I just become someone else entirely. So I'm not really as susceptible as I might be in my sort of more civilian life. The life where I'm like raising my kids and doing laundry and teaching and all the other things I do, where I allow myself to sort of feel normally about world events. Where the story of like a lost dog can set me off for hours. But when I was dealing with this material, I was really able to, for reasons that I couldn't explain, I don't know, but I felt very able to look at them clinically, and I was able to just sort of assess what had happened. That's not to say I never got overwhelmed, or certainly there were scenes in this book that were quite challenging to write, but I never let, at least the research process, overwhelm me, because I had a job to do and I really wanted to do it. My brother's a surgeon, and I've asked him, I'm really squeamish, and sometimes what he likes to do is send me an email. I think I'm allowed to tell this. He'll send me an email and it'll say like, important, please check it out, or something, and I click on it right away, and it's just a photo of like some viscera, he'll have a photo from a textbook or something. And so I'll expect a note about like my sister's birthday, and instead it's a huge textbook picture of like a cirrhotic liver or something, and I just want to barf. And I've asked him, like, how can you look at this stuff? How are you not, how can you look at it, touch it, go in there? He said, well, I have a job to do. It's my job. I have to transplant a liver, so that's what I do. Now, what I'm doing is not nearly, my brother's saving lives and I'm just making things up, but I sort of approach some of it the same way, which is like, I can look at it because it's my job. And so I do. And then maybe later I'll feel something, but in the moment I don't.
Lauren, I love your brother already.
Yeah, he's pretty
What a
funny.
great sense of humor that is.
Yeah.
But no, I look at it the same way. I mean, having been in the news, being a news reporter, you have to look at things. You're the observer. In other words, there was a friend of mine. We used to refer to him. That was at a wedding reception, and I was leaning against the wall. Everyone else was dancing on the floor, and I was leaning against the wall, looking at them. Then I looked out the window, and a friend of mine was looking in through the window, and I said, "Oh my God, the observer's observer." But I've always been comfortable on the wall, kind of looking at things at a distance, and then taking notes, and then telling people what I think of all of it. And so it's kind of a natural position, kind of being the observer.
Yeah.
Interesting. We're almost out of time. This is a question from Thomas. I think this one is for you, Lauren. Is the book best for kids or for adults to read? I know you a lot of the archives, I think, were for from kids. Is that
Well,
true?
there are kids in the book. I mean,
Right.
kids were a vital part of the Warsaw economy, the smuggling economy, because they were small enough to fit under the gates. So since the Nazis only allowed 250 calories a day into the ghetto, people were relying on children to smuggle in the food that they needed. So they would take whatever small belongings their parents might have, take them outside the gates, come back with potatoes or carrots or whatever they could scrounge. That said, although there are children characters in this book who are really vital to the book, and I like writing kids. I like kids, but it's not a book for kids. It's a high school student I think could read it, but it's a book for an adult audience.
Thank you. As I said, we're almost out of time, but I always like to end on what's next for you all, what projects you're working on, where we can find you now. So Lauren, what are you working on and where can we find you?
So I'm very findable. My email is Lauren Grodstein. I mean, my website is laurengrodstein.com, and anything you're interested in, including my book or other books, are there. I've been really interested in former Soviet spaces lately, starting, I think, with my trip to Warsaw, but also I was in Russia many years ago, and the war in Ukraine I find devastating, and that's a topic for another panel. But so I'm working on a book about about a novel about American and sort of places that used to be part of the USSR and different assumptions, and her own, she's in her mid-40s like I am, and grew up at the tail end of the Cold War like I did, and or remembers the tail end of the Cold War like I did, and then sort of on a trip she never intended to take, kind of confronts a history that's not like the one she learned in school. So it's really fun to write. It also involves travel, which I like. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Excellent. Congratulations. We'll look forward to that. Toni, what about you, other than broadcasting marathons?
Well, I'm a blogger. I follow the athletics world in that way. ToniReavis.com. That's Toni with an I. I always tell people, because it's the same St. Anthony of Padua, but in Eastern Europe it's Antoni, not Anthony. Of course, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and I said, "Mom, you've given me a girl's name. This is not helpful." But so it's Toni with an I, Reavis.com. And then I'm preparing for the outdoor circuit, road racing tour. And then I'd like Arthur's advice. I think I have my assignment to start a running book. So I think the time has come.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to that one as well. Thank you both so much for joining me today in this conversation. I really appreciate it. It was great to hear from both of you and read your beautiful books. Thank you again. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We have 2 more sessions coming up. One with Jordan Taylor, as we mentioned before, at 2:15 on YA mysteries, and another at 3:30 for the special editions of podcast John Updike's Ghost. So I hope to see you. And again, thank you, Toni and Lauren, so much. And I hope you both have a great afternoon, and everyone have a great day. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.